The scientists who built America's rockets, weapons, and space program had a secret. Many of them had been Nazis, not just Nazi sympathizers, card-carrying members of the Nazi Party who had used concentration camp prisoners as slave labor to build weapons for Adolf Hitler. And the United States government knew exactly who they were when they hired them. This is Operation Paperclip, the classified program that brought over 1,600 Nazi scientists to America after World War II, gave them new identities, erased their records, and put them to work. While American prosecutors were sentencing Nazi war criminals to death at Nuremberg, American intelligence officers were quietly recruiting the scientists those same Nazis had relied on. The program was so secret that President Truman specifically ordered that no one with a Nazi record or who had been an active Nazi supporter could be brought to America. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency simply rewrote the scientists' records to remove the inconvenient parts. Files were altered, pasts were erased. War criminals became American employees. To understand why this happened, you have to understand the panic that gripped Washington in the final months of World War II. As Allied forces pushed into Germany from both sides, American intelligence officers realized that the Soviet Union was racing to capture the same thing they were: German scientific knowledge. The Nazis had made extraordinary advances in rocketry, aviation, chemical weapons, and medicine during the war. Much of that knowledge existed only in the minds of German scientists. Whoever captured those scientists would have a massive military advantage in the war that everyone could already see coming. The Cold War had not officially started yet, but the race for German scientific talent began in 1945. The most famous of the scientists recruited under Operation Paperclip was Wernher von Braun. Von Braun was the lead engineer behind the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, which Germany had used to bomb London and other Allied cities, killing thousands of civilians. The V-2 rockets were built in an underground factory called Mittelwerk, using slave labor from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Prisoners who were too weak to work were hanged from the factory's own cranes as a warning to others. Historical records indicate that more people died building the V-2 rocket than were killed by the rocket itself. Von Braun knew this. He visited the factory. He selected prisoners for the work. After the war, he told American interrogators he had been horrified by the conditions. The Americans decided they believed him. Von Braun was brought to the United States, given a comfortable life in Huntsville, Alabama, and eventually became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. He was the architect of the Saturn V rocket that took American astronauts to the moon. He received the National Medal of Science from President Kennedy. He died in 1977, celebrated as one of the greatest engineers in American history. The survivors of Mittelbau-Dora received nothing. Von Braun was not an exception. He was the template. Walter Schreiber was a Nazi doctor who had conducted medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners, including deliberately infecting them with plague, smallpox, and typhus to test vaccines. He was brought to the United States and worked for the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine in Texas. When a journalist exposed his background in 1952, the US government quietly moved him to Argentina rather than face the publicity of deporting him back to Germany for prosecution. Kurt Lohm was the Nazi scientist in charge of Germany's biological warfare program who had experimented on concentration camp prisoners with plague bacteria. He was recruited by the US Army Chemical Corps to share his research on biological weapons. He was never prosecuted. Walter Dornberger was a Nazi general who had personally ordered the execution of concentration camp prisoners at the V2 factory and had been sentenced to death by a British military tribunal. The United States intervened, brought him to America, and he went on to work for Bell Aerospace as a vice president. The pattern repeated itself across all 1,600 scientists brought over under Operation Paperclip. Records were altered, war crimes were minimized or erased entirely. Men who had participated in some of the worst atrocities of the war were given security clearances, government salaries, and comfortable American lives. The justification given internally was simple and cold. The Soviets were doing the same thing. If America did not recruit these scientists, the Soviets would. And American security required their knowledge more than it required justice for their victims. The existence of Operation Paperclip was classified for decades. It was not officially acknowledged by the United States government until 1973. Full details of what had been done to screen and alter the scientists' records did not emerge until researchers began accessing declassified documents in the 1980s and 1990s. By that time, most of the scientists were dead. The statute of limitations on any potential charges had long expired. The survivors of the concentration camps where these men had worked had spent decades watching their tormentors live comfortable, celebrated lives in America while the world told them the Nazis had been defeated and justice had been done. Justice had not been done. It had been traded for rocket science. The Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969 is one of the greatest achievements in human history. The man most responsible for the rocket that made it possible had watched concentration camp prisoners being hanged in the factory where he worked and said nothing. That is the contradiction at the heart of Operation Paperclip. America built its greatest triumphs on the work of men who had committed some of history's worst crimes. And it decided that was a trade worth making. The question Operation Paperclip forces you to ask is not whether your government is capable of making that kind of calculation. It already did. The question is whether any achievement built on that foundation can ever be completely separated from what it cost.